All right, we are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these episodes, guests get to share their journey of successes and setbacks with a primary focus on how they've overcome specific obstacles that otherwise could have ended the journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Alyssa Holland. Alyssa, thanks so much for coming on the episode today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I was excited to get to know you a little bit before today's episode, and you come with kind of a wealth of accessibility knowledge. So thank you so much for joining me, so that the audience that's listening to the episode today can get to know you. Maybe we dive into a little bit about yourself, how you became a leader in the space, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. So my name is Alyssa. I have been a software developer for the past 10 years, focusing on the front end for the last 7. How I really got into accessibility is probably about 5 years ago. I was working at a higher education company, and one of my main responsibilities was as a component library maintainer. And so up until that point, I had heard the word accessibility and knew something that was important, but I had no idea like how to actually implement accessible solutions. And so at this job, my manager was very bullish on accessibility, and like everything we implemented had to adhere to accessible guidelines. And through that job is what I learned when I learned like how to implement accessible component patterns, how to reference things like the ARIA Authoring Practices guide to implement those patterns. And so I like to say that through that experience, I developed what I like to refer to as a lens for accessibility. And just like a camera lens that you can kind of focus in and out, like I feel like my mind is focused on accessibility now. And like every time I'm implementing something, I try to think of it through that lens. And so I'm so passionate about it that I created a course on accessibility, all about kind of providing an approachable way to build accessible components, because sometimes it can be a little tricky. But yeah, that's just kind of a quick overview of how I got into it in my experience.
So I want to go back to the bullish manager. It's awesome to
Yeah.
go join an organization where accessibility is a priority. Did this Was it influenced because you're in the higher ed space where maybe that industry is very focused on it? Was it in the company culture? Um, yeah,
Yeah.
elaborate on that
Yeah,
for.
that's a good question. I do believe because it was in the higher education space that, and because you have, a wide array of students that they did need to adhere to it, and they would pay for things like accessibility audits and things that we had to do. I remember my manager saying one time that like, the fact that the company is paying for this is indicative that they are, this is a priority for them. And so, yeah, so I think a lot of that led to it because I've been at, other companies where maybe their products aren't so much customer facing, and because of or a wide array, I guess you have more of like a narrowed down scope. And I found that accessibility is not as much of a priority in those kind of areas. So I do think because it was how far reaching it was that I did adhere to it.
And so, what did the introduction or the indoctrination look like for you when you joined the organization?
Um, like as far as you mean, as far as just me like learning and like kind of just getting introduced to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and how you had mentioned a focus of building out the component
Mm.
library for them. So I'm curious,
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. So, like I said, up until that point, I was kind of still relatively new to React, and so and our component library was built in React, and some of the components had been built out already. But like we had a lot of like baseline components, so like buttons, form inputs, like text areas, text inputs. And what we did or how it was done is that like some of them are already built, but I had to create some new ones. And so he would show me like, okay, here is the first time I heard about something called like the ARIA Authoring Practices guide, which I mentioned earlier, and that is like kind of a I think it's created by like the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, and like it's kind of
Yep.
a good standard for implementing accessible components. And so that's where I learned like how to read through that documentation, how to like test, how to use a screen reader. Actually, he showed me how to use VoiceOver on Mac for the first time, and how to use a screen reader, so that as you're implementing, you're actually testing. So it was kind of a lot of that, like, hey, here's one example of it being done correctly, and then now we need to apply that. Here's kind of the pattern over here, and here's how we need to apply it. And it's really was about just equipping developers to so that we have these baseline things that are already accessible that kind of infiltrate the product.
Yeah. So were there other team members working on the component library, or was that something that you kind of own?
I would say my manager, it was like 3 of us that were
Yeah.
probably like could like approve PRs and things. So it was a small group, which I actually think was good because he just kind of like this governing body. My manager, obviously the most experienced, he kind of had most of the say, and then it was kind of me and this other. I was more of a mid-level developer there, so me and then a senior developer. But I did do a good portion of it, yeah. And so that's kind of how we kind of governed it. And other teams could contribute to that component library, but we would like do all the pull request reviews, and so I guess so that we could make sure things are adhering to accessible standards.
It's awesome to hear that, you were building on a library that was kind of accessible,
Mhm.
focused. Did you find that the audits that you were running on for the app overall and,
Mhm.
and the website, did things improve over time because you were working from a framework that was accessible to begin with?
Yeah, I think so. I can tell that, like when I joined, I think they really had like a lot of the. I think the key was that the design system that they had really incorporated a lot of the components, and so because of that, we did get a lot of accessibility gains by default. Of course, there are other parts in the app that don't necessarily use the components. So, but like we had quality assurance that would test for that as well. Like so, QA was embedded in the process to ensure that as we implemented new features, that those were also accessible.
The organizations that I speak with that have the most success
Mhm.
is it's a little bit of a process oriented approach and a methodology, but it's also the a framework of how you build. And so you went on to launch some coursework.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about what some of the goals are of the coursework that you're building out.
Yeah, so the course is actually called the Approachable Guide to Accessible Components. So as you can tell from the name, that's the goal. But I guess I found that it took a while for building accessible components to click. Like I could kind of understand how voiceover works. I didn't understand like how to use it all the time, and sometimes the documentation. There's so much documentation actually on accessibility, but it is so much more than just slapping on ARIA attributes, right? Like it's really making sure you understand, like understanding it was kind of different things, like understanding that what am I building? Like, what does it look like? But then, like, what is the actual functionality? And then correlating that to what's in the documentation. And so I just had some growing pains with that before it really clicked for me. And so my goal with the course was to like, okay, how can I make this more approachable? So it's kind of the course is split into like 2 phases. I like to call them. Phase 1 is just the foundational stuff. I'm teaching you things like why accessibility is important, legal implications, things like that. Like how it's not just about people with disabilities. It can really help everybody. I teach you terminology because there's a lot of acronyms in the accessibility world. So I terminology like accessibility tree. What is ARIA? What is WA ARIA? A11Y, what does that stand for? And all those kinds of things. And, more foundational stuff like using alt text on images, labels and inputs and things like that. And then the latter half of the course is really all about implementing those things. So we actually implement like a tabs component pattern, and I show you how to do it looking at the guide like the ARIA Authoring Practices guide, the APG. I'll say that now; it's a mouthful, and how to do that like step by step and testing it. And then I also show, kind of what I've been seeing is a new wave of stuff with these headless component libraries like Radix UI, and those allow you to kind of bring your own CSS, but they have a lot of accessibility built in. So showing you both approaches so that you know how to do it on your own, but then can also leverage third-party libraries and how to vet them as well to make sure they're accessible. So I do kind of a side by side. So that's kind of the goal of the course, just to kind of show you in kind of these atomic components how you can make something accessible.
Without going too deep into the coursework, how do you
Mhm.
vet the open source? I mean, so much
Yeah.
of an application, I think, is probably layered in a multitude of standard components, customization, open source. So,
Yeah.
what is the framework to go about vetting the component libraries or uh, the front,
Yeah.
some of the front end that you're going to be taking on?
Yeah, so and like in my course in particular, we we implemented, like I said, tabs component, manually, and then we looked at Radix UI's tabs component. And what I did is I brought up the APG guide for the tabs component, and then we do things like, okay, tabbing through should do this. Using the right arrow goes between this tabs, like the screen reader should announce, and that's literally how I do it. Because a lot of times, sometimes when you use automated tools, like I was using the XDev tools, for example, sometimes you can get like 100% clear, but that's not, there's still a lot to do there. And so I show like, okay, how it's tabbing, like doing the keyboard navigations, showing what voiceover announces and all that, and then making sure that complies with what the APG guide says. And so that's one way, that's how I really showed, so that you can see. I also inspected like the DOM and showing you like, hey, here's where the ARIA attribute is being applied. Here's where it's saying ARIA selected equals true or whatever, like, and showing you, not only from a screen reader perspective, but also how you can inspect it from developer tools, so that you can also see, like looking at the accessibility tree. That's how I really kind of got very granular, so that you can, see both ways.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Would you say over the last 7 years
Mm-hmm.
to a decade, like you've seen an evolution in how accessibility is tackled? How are you keeping up with the education that you need to then go out and empower other folks?
Yeah. So, I took what my manager taught me and then expanded upon that. Like I said, because I became so passionate about it, and I felt like I had some gaps in my knowledge. So I know there was a course. Oh gosh, I think it was through Udacity, or is it Udacity? I can't remember. It's like a Google course or something on accessibility. So I did that first, and that was just for me to expand my own knowledge way before I was ever thinking about creating a course. And then I also, as I was creating the course, I saw that, like, I think the WCAG got updated or something, and I kind of like try to see what those things are doing, listening to podcasts and things on the topic, trying to just, I'm always a learner. And sometimes in the space it doesn't move super fast, but like keeping aware of like, what is like HTML doing to maybe help like do things. Like I've heard of the I think it's the select inputs has been getting a lot of updates, like just seeing how the browser is kind of handling accessibility, like what's maybe recommended, what's not. And so that's kind of how I do it. Just make sure I'm reading documentation and seeing what's been updated. So yeah.
So as you've scaled your own coursework, but
Mhm.
but most importantly, within the organizations that you've been developing, how have you addressed some of the challenges that you've come across?
Um, I think that's a good question. I've really tried my best to educate other developers if I can on it. And then, trying to think of ways, if I'm thinking from like a company standpoint, getting stakeholder buy-in is sometimes hard. Thinking of ways I can maybe automate that process or make it easier, which is why I like component libraries so much, is because you can kind of have a hand in kind of helping out developers with it. But I guess I think that's a way how I've been trying to kind of make an impact with it. I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but yeah.
Well, what I'm hearing is that the education and the buy-in is
Yeah.
still a major challenge.
Yeah, it is. Getting people, I just think it's a morally right thing to do, but sometimes, when you have deadlines and things need to get done, accessibility is unfortunately often an afterthought. And, when I'm having to work with legacy component libraries that don't have accessibility built in, I don't always have the freedom and leeway to be able to do it. And so you sometimes have to rely on like, okay, well, maybe, if you want more enterprise clients, like this may be unfortunately it kind of has to get to that point sometimes. And even then it's kind of hard. Some enterprise clients will require maybe you to be a certain compliance level. But yeah, it's tricky. Not everyone is as passionate as you are about it, obviously. But so it's a fine line to have. I probably was known as maybe the annoying girl that was always bringing up accessibility, but I try to educate, not just be like, this is what should be done. But yeah, I don't think it's a thing that like developers don't want to do it. It's just, I think it's just a lack of maybe understanding how to do it. It's so much more, like I said, than just slapping on ARIA attributes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the brands that I speak to, they're just completing major efforts to get to 2.0.
Hmm.
And we know that 2.1 and 2.2 from a YCAG perspective are now out, and there's going to be
Yeah.
a new set of standards. And so it kind of that and the legacy code or the afterthought approach.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in that place as a brand, which I think a lot of if we're building an app for the first time, that's awesome.
Right.
Was talking to one organization where they just want to reskin the front end and get
Yep.
out of a legacy code base and into something a little bit more modern framework. What's your advice
Mm.
from one? You're a brand who's kind of chasing maybe a standard or two below where we're at from a
Okay.
YCAG 2.2 perspective. That's question number one. And if it mixes into that is you have a legacy app or
Mm.
you have an app already on the marketplace, right? Which means you have a legacy app in some
Yeah.
way, shape, or form. And how do you deal with that code structure?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one, because more often than not, we are dealing with legacy applications, right? Like,
Yeah.
and
Or an
that's just
existing, let's call it an existing
existing.
app.
Yes, exactly. It's fun when you do get to do greenfield development, but more, more often than not, it becomes, yeah, existing, and you got to kind of clean it off. So, okay, if you have an existing legacy application, it's tricky, and I can't say that I've really like mastered it or anything,
Yeah.
because it's just a matter, I think, of like maybe as you are updating the legacy application with stuff, is trying to make sure, I guess leaving it better maybe than how you found it, like trying to incorporate accessibility if you can. Sometimes it's tricky because you don't want to break certain things. But it's just really trying to. I don't know if there's really I can give you a good solution for it, but it's trying to, I guess, do little changes as you can. Sometimes I see simple thing. A common thing I see is like using a div as a button, because I think button styles are kind of ugly off the bat, right? They're kind of these, and they don't want. I think they don't want to do the CSS reset on it, and so like just simple things I'll find like, okay, make this an actual button, and then do this, just things, simple things like that. If you can clean up, that maybe won't cause you to do too many sweeping changes. But yeah, I think just incremental stuff. It's not, it's hard to be able to change everything, because a lot of times you're just beholden to the component library and things that you have, and at the end of the day, you're getting paid to implement the feature in X amount of time, and a product usually wants it done yesterday. So it's a tough one, but trying to find wins when you can.
Mm.
Yeah.
Would you highlight any personal challenges that you've had to overcome?
Um, I think, yeah, I mean, the common one I've just been harping on is like, I sometimes have a complex between how I want to implement it, and then the timeline I have to do it. And like I said, you're beholden to the legacy libraries that you have. But it's, I guess, a setback or challenge I've had is just like I've just had to kind of accept sometimes that, like, I've done what I can to try and put out the good word about accessibility and provide knowledge, and explain the value of it, but um trying to not feel guilty also, I guess, if you have to implement something a certain way, that's maybe not ideal because the component's already there and it speeds you up, but it's not accessible and you know it, and you kind of like, so that's, I guess, a setback, is that kind of finding that balance, and
Mm.
trying to just continue, as we have retrospectives and things as engineering teams, or meetings, is like trying to just continue to be like, hey, this is something I think we should prioritize from the beginning, and not getting discouraged, I guess. Yeah.
For the team members and your peers that you've worked with,
Hmm.
do you find that once there's a crash course or a level of education that it kind of levels the playing field on how the team's looking at it? Because I could appreciate, like, if you're off, working on one module of the application and you have these best practices, and then someone
Yeah.
else is kind of not on the same page.
Yeah, I do think education helps. I do think there's definitely a difference. Truly being like a subject matter expert in it, which I guess I could maybe say I am. That feels a little bit weird, but I have put a lot of hours into it, and I guess at one point I was questioning, like, I'm kind of saying I'm a subject matter expert by creating a course in this, so I guess I'll just go with it. Like yeah, there's a little bit of a difference there, but I think doing by example as well, like, is good too. Like, calling out in PRs, maybe like why I did change something, like adding, ARIA attributes and like to enhance things. Like, I think leading by example too, and so other developers can maybe see like, oh, okay, this is how it was done in this particular widget or whatever. So okay, I can probably apply a similar thing there. Or so yeah, I think that's one way.
Something I wanted to go back to
Mhm,
was um, this balance of your desired input or how maybe to implement
mhm.
certain functionality, the timeline that product is set, and ultimately
Yeah.
what the product requirements are. Have you found that there's a bigger focus from product on making sure that it's accessible, or like, we're speaking about it from
Mm.
a
Yeah.
front end development perspective, but ultimately, the framework that I kind of look at accessibility from is it touches all aspects
Everything.
of the content
Yeah.
supply of the organization.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you can, we talked about leading by example and
Mhm.
giving, the your fellow peers in the front end space examples, but how do
Mhm.
you change that
Yeah.
circle of influence around you?
Um, I like to think I'm planting a seed when I am doing it. Like I said, trying to have resources there. Um, leading by example in the code. A lot of times, I think this stuff stems higher up from like when us developers actually get hands on keyboard. I truly believe that a lot of accessibility starts from design. We have to implement what's there. Just simple things like color contrast ratios. Yeah, like all just basic stuff, and sometimes that's not even there. And so a lot of times, even if I am working with a component that's accessible, the colors and stuff I have to use are not. And so I think it stems from design. And if I see that difference between like when I was at the company where accessibility was prioritized to where it was not. And I think it's always when I have brought it up, sometimes it's been like, well, um, I can see the colors fine, but it's like it's getting out of that mindset, I think, also of just like how do I perceive this, and like what is like there's standards and stuff in place for this reason, right? So it's not so that it's more objective than just a subjective thing.
Mm,
Um and not just thinking about it from like oh, well, our clients don't have a disability, so it doesn't matter kind of thing. And a lot of times it's when I brought it up, it's like, oh, it's not a priority right now. That's what I always get told. It's not a priority right now. And at the end of the day, like that's above my pay grade, and I don't get to say those things. I can just plant the seed and bring it up in things. But um, yeah, I think it's just like I said, from design funneling down, and then also making it that like this feature is not done until it meets a certain thing. But that's a really difficult thing to kind of get into an organization that doesn't understand the importance of it. So
mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting. It's where it's like, oh, we don't have enough time to
Yeah.
implement accessibility. Like, to me, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, right?
Yeah.
Because if we don't have these components and
Mhm.
structure and a DOM that's accessible, then sure, like
Yeah.
time is always going to be challenging because you kind of need to gut the framework. And so, um, yeah, I don't have a perfect answer for that, but it's
I'm sure there's a
when
lot of
you're up
developers
against the
fighting this
sprint
fight.
deadline and the
Yeah.
sprint closes out in 5 days, like
Yeah.
what are we going to do? We're going to rewrite that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of developers are fighting this fight, you know what I mean? Like, I work at primarily smaller companies now, especially at smaller companies, I think maybe sometimes, and I have an altruistic view about things. I don't really think it's that, like, we don't care about people with disabilities or anything, or we don't care. It's just not maybe understanding the pathway to it and thinking that it's gonna be this huge impediment to progress. So that's how I like to think, and I think it's just, like I said, lack of education maybe around it, but I don't think it's that people don't care. That's my mindset on it, at least.
I agree because I believe that we're inherently um, intending to do good. But
Yeah,
when you hear things like, well, it's not a priority for the organization, it's like,
yeah,
or we don't have this type of audience coming to our app or our website. And,
mhm,
I wish, and there's probably a little bit of like, personal information that can't be shared about, do users have accessible preferences that are coming to your website? Because
Yeah.
when you can back these things up with data, it gets a lot easier.
Hmm.
Um, but a lot of folks that I talk to find that pathway unclear, murky,
Yeah.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
Um, and so I know there's a lot of prioritization matrix that have been produced, and you know, ultimately you need to start somewhere. You've given some really insightful ways of how to go about
Hmm.
getting from an education to a component library, but
Hmm. Yeah, and I think maybe UX experience too, like having that. Like I sometimes try to talk to customer support even to kind of see like, are you getting complaints about this? And I was just we're just at like a little meetup, and I think I was talking about something like color contrast, and she was like, oh yeah, like I think I've had a customer to complain that it's been a little bit hard for them to read, and hearing that, but I guess it doesn't get passed down. It's not a breaking bug or something, but hearing that from me is like, oh, okay, there is some validity to that. It's just sometimes we're so far removed, I think, from that. Yeah. Hmm.
so are there disruptions coming that you're excited about,
Yeah.
or not?
Yeah, I'm taking disruption as to be a positive. So I I feel like the easy answer to say like AI, but like or not
Yeah, I'm not
the
going to
most
let you off
the
with
most
just saying AI.
no most obvious answer. But I'm kind of tired of talking about AI. So how I see it is so there's this thing called the OpenUI. I think it's open-ui.org, and it's a W3C community group. And their goal is to make pre-existing components like selects and range inputs, which are notoriously hard to style, easier to deal with. And I think on that committee are like some well-known people in like the developer community and stuff. And they have this whole like specs and guidelines and things that if you go to that site, you can see like so. Um, it's it's really like a way to extend HTML to include common components that don't like or yeah. So sorry, the OpenUI is kind of doing that. Like, hey, here are these pre-existing components. Here's what we want to do. But I've also seen where the OpenUI is doing things like extending HTML to include common components that don't currently exist. For example, the tabs component that I was mentioning that you have to kind of implement separately, and then common thing also is cards. So the overall goal it seems like of that initiative is to like kind of reduce the need for having to reach for third party solutions and improve the baseline components that we have in native HTML just to make it easier for people to even implement accessible. Because a lot of times when you're reaching for these libraries, it's like I actually wrote an article for Smashing Magazine called like teaching people how to style the range input because it's such a pain. Like you have to do all these vendor prefixes, pseudo classes, and all these things. And so I think they're just trying to make it easier so that you don't have to go through all these hoops. And just and also I think just having these more accessible baselines already in there or providing attributes that you can leverage. So that's something I'm really excited about, and I've been monitoring and seeing and seeing who's on the board of that, and just kind of watching and seeing. It's going to take a while before I think fully flesh out everything there, but that's something I've been really excited about seeing.
The statement you just made about elevating the baseline, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the best thing that I've picked up on was if we can start from a better place, because if
Hmm.
you think back 7 years ago, what was the baseline? Probably nothing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Now we have some things like I mentioned, the headless component libraries, but that's still relatively newish. I think of the last 5 years or so, maybe. But and that makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, I think if you have it just built in, that'd be a big step. So that's a disruption that I'm excited to see.
Is there any new coursework that you're planning for 2025?
I am not planning to do as far as me producing anything, no. But because that was it was a labor of love for sure to create that. But I'm excited to be starting a new job soon, and I think I'm excited to try and incorporate some accessibility patterns. I think one of my roles would be implementing a design system, and so trying to carry over what I learned in my job 5 years ago and do it again at this new company. So that's what I'm excited about.
I love it.
Yeah.
I always love to close out by giving you the open mic, no pun intended, just to share anything or even ask me something that we didn't get to cover. Is there anything that you want to close out with?
I just want to say, I think accessibility sometimes gets a rep for being like easy to do, and I actually think it's a nuanced thing, I think, I just want to say, let's all work together to make the web a more accessible place. I think that's all I really want to say is that, yeah, I think little by little we can get there.
I love it. I couldn't have closed out in a better way. Alyssa, I want to thank you again for coming on the episode today. It's amazing how fast these conversations are just like,
I know.
but a wealth of information, and I really appreciate spending the last half hour with me.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been great. I really appreciate you having me on. This was fun.
Cool.